Thank you, everyone. Can you hear me? Sometimes my voice gets a little soft. It's my natural voice to be soft. So don't be afraid. Don't be shy to do this. And that might remind me. Thank you, Father Joseph, for the introduction. Actually, for the invitation to come here. When I was invited, I'm always happy to get these invitations, not for my own ego, but it kind of tells that particular groups and communities are actually interested, in this topic, particularly since Magnificat came out. So it was very encouraging to hear that. Thank you all who are joining at home for Zoom. That's the wondrous tool of technology that you can join us from a distance. And of course, those who are here, actually, it's actually becoming more of a luxury to gather physically in close proximity. It used to be the opposite, luxury to afford the technology. Now to actually join together in physical close proximity is it's a major feat sometimes, especially with our busy lives. So, yeah, of course, sort of like Dr. Tanier, how do I talk about this one topic in an hour? I'm going to try to do that in some ways. I'm going to divide it into three parts. Basically, it's always good to know about our history. And so in the first part, I'm going to talk about the church's journey specifically as it engaged in AI for the past, I say, 10 years, per se. I could ultimately go back to Vatican II, into Mirifica and the document on media and communications, but particularly AI. It's actually been in conversation with the Vatican for 10 years. It didn't appear with Magnificat Humanitas. And then going to talk about the encyclical itself, Magnificat Humanitas, kind of give a broad stroke, particular themes that comes out of that. And then what I want to do is give you 5 frameworks for Christian diakrisis. I will explain what that Greek term means. Usually when people ask me, and I've been interviewed a lot, they always ask, like, any person that might ask, like a mother might ask me, what do I do, Father Ricky, with my child when it comes to AI? Or I've been a consultor for bishops and other, ecclesial spaces. And the answer I always give them is the best thing you could ever give anyone is a set of discernment frameworks. Because as I'm going to show, it's both and. And Dr. Tiner kind of talked about that. AI is both, has a lot of perils, but it has a lot of promises. So we need just discernment starting points to navigate through this time to this age of AI. So with that in mind, let's go into this history. Pope Leo XIV, when he signed his first encyclical on May 15th, the date was intentional. It marked the 135th anniversary of Pope Leo XIII, Rerum Novarum, back in 1891. The encyclical that responded essentially to the industrial capitalism and the transformed conditions of labor. And it was neat to learn from Father Joseph, the history and the legacy of your own founder, how that's all connected to this moment, to what's going on in the world. So Rerum Novarum became one of the foundations of modern Catholic social teaching. By choosing its anniversary, the Vatican, whenever they come up with any document, it has to be a particular date. They're obsessed with particular dates. Leo XIV connected the Church's response to the Industrial Revolution with the need to speak again as artificial intelligence begins to reshape work and the distribution of social power. The Church's journey, Leo has entered a conversation that has already been developing for more than a decade. In some ways, we can actually go back to Laudate Si, Pope Francis's. Now, he doesn't talk about artificial intelligence. You won't see that term there, but he does talk about the technocratic paradigm. And the technocratic paradigm is basically, how do we see the world, a worldview where technology, optimization, productivity is the high standard or evaluation point for humanity. So he's criticizing that from an ecological perspective. That's causing a lot of ecological chaos, the idea of technology in the industrial world we're living in now. So in some ways, I like to always trace it back there because Pope Leo will kind of pick up on that. In 2016, the Vatican began convening the Minerva Dialogues. And these conversations brought church leaders and theologians together with people working in technology, law, and ethics. If you ever go to Rome, Santa Maria sopra Minerva, it's a church built on top of the temple, the ancient temple of Minerva, who was the goddess of wisdom. So Pope Francis began to meet there, and we don't know the exact people he invited. Some people say Eric Schmidt of Google was there, people from IBM. He began to have this dialogue with them 10 years ago. It kind of shows that he was already on board with what's to come. And then in January 1st, really for this particular year, 2024, Pope Francis will begin to he'll begin to bring all these people together. He'll have he spoke at the World Day of Peace in January 1st. For the first time, he brought that out in public about his views on AI. On April 2nd, the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith presented Dignitas Infinita, infinite dignity, affirming that every human being possesses an intrinsic and inalienable dignity rooted in who the person is, inalienable, that we're all given dignity from God. Government, an organization cannot take that dignity away from us. It's innate. It's inalienable within us. So it's rooted in that understanding of dignity, rather than dignity coming from other resources. We already, by virtue of being human, we have that dignity. Francis then devoted the World Communications Day. He devoted his speech called Artificial Intelligence and the Wisdom of the Heart. And in June 14, 2024, he became the first pope to speak at the G7 summit, and he talked about artificial intelligence and called for a better politics. But so this is really building up in some ways. That same year, in October, he brought together 70 AI experts, mostly developers from all over, from Google to MIT and universities, Catholic University and Notre Dame. Were there people who do the Hollow app, right? All of the Catholic developers came together for that. I was privileged and humbled to have spoken at that. I spoke about the prophetic role of the Catholic Church during this age of AI. January 1st, we have kind of like the first major, big document, but an official document on AI. It's a note, not the most, it's not an encyclical, but it talks about AI in as far as an official document. The document described AI as a product of human intelligence and reserved intelligence in its fullest sense for the embodied human person. And Dr. Tenier talked a bit about that. Human intelligence develops through a life lived with others and carries moral responsibilities. AI can perform particular functions associated with intelligence, sometimes at levels far beyond human ability. I myself cannot speak over 100 languages, right? Yet the human person who created and employed these systems remain responsible for their purposes and effects. And so Antiqua et Nova, Ancient and New, kind of talks about, these areas. It begins to break down the differences between intelligence, human intelligence. The last part gives 10 items, like how do we look at war, how do we look at education, and these areas. That leads us then to Magnifica Humanitas, a new encyclical for a new age. Okay. With Magnifica Humanitas, Pope Leo gathered this developing reflection into the first encyclical of his pontificate. AI now appears among the res novae. So it's Rare Novarum translates of new things. And back then, 135 years ago, the new thing was the industrial age and all of that. And then AI is now among the new things that are going on, to which the church must bring the light of the gospel. The encyclical therefore belongs to the continuing development of Catholic social teaching. The church receives the questions of each age while drawing upon a wisdom concerning the human person that reaches far beyond any one technological moment. I want to turn toward this encyclical specifically, which I'm going to stay there. 10 days after he signed it, He launched it, right? And you may have watched that in the early wee hours of May 25th. I think it was 5:30 in the morning. I was awake. And among the speakers alongside cardinals and theologians was Christopher Olah. You may have heard about this, the co-founder of Anthropic, who makes Claude. Claude is one of the large language models, right, along with ChatGPT, and probably it could include Google's DeepMind, right? So, so the fact that Christopher Olah was there to also present kind of shows the inclusivity, this approach that the church is, they're interested. We have to have developers because, and he'll say this in encyclical, we don't have all the answers of AI. We're not tech experts. But also, there's another reason. It's the people in technology and governments who hold the power, right? This is part of the wisdom that began 10 years ago. Pope Francis probably saw that too. They're the ones with the power making it, and it's only a few of them. So how do we discern this together or alongside with them? At the conclusion of the event, Leo declared that AI must be disarmed. You may have heard that, right, in the news. Now, he's not saying he's a technophobe. He's not against technology. When he's saying disarmed, he's saying we have to free it from the forces, that where it could become an instrument of destruction, or become an instrument of domination, exclusion, or even death. We have to disarm those components of AI. He acknowledged that the church does not claim to possess every technical know-how or detail about how AI is created. In issuing an encyclical, which is a formal papal letter, the church has a different purpose. And in some ways, this is the definition of encyclical: to bring Catholic beliefs into conversation with contemporary concerns and offer moral guidance on a particular subject. Let me repeat that. To bring Catholic beliefs into conversation with contemporary concerns, right? And offer moral guidance on a particular subject. It's interesting, up until this point, most encyclicals, the last few at least, were always addressed to the bishops with the intention that the bishops, of course, will disseminate that to the people of God. This encyclical, right there in Texas, is to all the Catholic faithful and to all Christians and to people of goodwill. So right away, it's for everyone, dissemination or not, In short, and this is a kind of a paraphrase of my whole talk, this encyclical calls for the inalienable dignity of every human person, created in God's image, that's the faith dimension, to remain at the center of technological development and its social consequences. Technology can serve humanity, no doubt, yet it is never neutral, and Dr. Tenier talked about that. It must be directed toward the common good, with God guiding our actions and the human person remaining at the center of our choices. You're going to hear me repeat this a lot in different ways throughout the next 45 minutes or so. Thus, the encyclical begins with the human person. It's titled Magnificat Humanitas, Magnificent Humanity, directs us toward the grandeur of humanity as God's creation and our responsibility to safeguard that. Leo recognizes the genuine good technology can accomplish. But he also insists that every AI system bears the marks of human choices. It's still made by human beings, okay? So people can determine its purpose, decide what it will be, decide where it will be trusted, and choose which risk others may be asked to carry. Catholic social teaching develops through an encounter between the enduring truth of the gospel and the concrete questions of history. Leo makes it a process of shared discernment, end quote, a process of shared discernment. We're not the technical experts here, but you might not be the moral experts here. Let's have a shared conversation, discernment process. And that's really what he wants to do, which is not saying he's a technophobe or pro or against. We just have to discern this together. And one of the most endearing, this is all part of the introduction, images is this idea of comparing the Tower of Babel with the rebuilding of Jerusalem. The people of Babel possess a common language and a technical ability to undertake an ambitious project. They place those capacities at the service of their desire to make a name for themselves and secure their own power Seeing a lot of parallels? All right. In other words, in Babel, they build up, but it's not necessarily toward God. They bring people together to build us up, but that's not necessarily communion, right? Because it's kind of imploding, and then it's going to explode, right? So Leo calls this the Babel syndrome, whenever technological development requires the weak to carry its costs. Babel also appears when the language of data claims the power to capture the whole meaning of a person. Can technology, is that everything what a human being is? That's what he's asking. AI can identify patterns in human behavior with remarkable speed, right? But no AI tool or system can exhaust the mystery of a human person standing before God. Right? Jerusalem offers another approach, another paradigm of building. Nehemiah, here is the city's walls lies in ruin. This is after the Babylonian exile, right? When they come back, one of the first things they do, of course, is rebuild the temple. But after even the rebuilding the temple, the walls and the infrastructure of the city is in need of repair. Nehemiah is tasked to take care of that. What does he do first? He doesn't come up he doesn't email, and he doesn't come up with PowerPoint slides or even a plan. He doesn't even ask AI what to do. He prays first. He fasts first. He prays and fasts. And then he surveys the walls, all the damages. Then he begins to assign particular groups of people to different parts of the walls. Okay, the guards will take this portion of the wall to build up. The priests of the temple will take this portion of the wall. This family will take that part. The goldsmiths will take that part. You see? And so that's the wisdom that Leo is trying to show us. So different people assume responsibility for different portions of the wall. The city rises because they share a common purpose while contributing according to their own place within the community. Their work, most of all, remains rooted in God. Okay? The rebuilding of Jerusalem, therefore, gives us, the church, a spiritual pattern for responding to AI. We begin by attending to the world as it actually is, including the experiences of those already affected by technological change. What about those in the margins? The work of rebuilding then becomes a shared work. Those whose lives will be shaped by technology must have a place in the decisions that surround it. Very Catholic. Okay? Babel and Jerusalem represent two ways of using human power. Babel employs shared ability to secure control. Jerusalem, on the other hand, gathers people into a common work in which their differences remain visible and valuable, i.e. remains transparent and workable and doable. And so the encyclical therefore asks what kind of civilization our technologies are helping us build. The human person before God. Christian anthropology supplies the measure of answering that question. The human person is created in the image and likeness of God and called into communion with God. Part of our dignity in being created in the image of God is because God wanted us to be in communion with God's self and with all people, with one another. Human dignity is received before it is ever demonstrated through intelligence or social usefulness. It remains when human dignity remains when illness or disability makes a person dependent upon the care of others. The distinction between human and artificial intelligence begins there. AI may reproduce certain functions associated with human intelligence and surpass and do so in computational speed. The processing of information, however, does not give a system an embodied history of a life received from God. Nor does the system become morally responsible for what follows from its output. If something goes wrong, we talked about already the rogue AI, right, that happened this past week. The AI system is not responsible for that. The people who created that are, right? The AI model or tool doesn't have to stand before God. We do. And see, this is where the Catholic faith and morality comes in. Leo is also concerned about how encounters with AI may shape what we expect from human relationships. I'm going to touch upon that later. As these systems become increasingly capable of simulating human presence, the distinction between assistance and genuine encounter becomes all the more important. What's that distinction? I'll talk about that later. The Christian understanding of the body becomes important here too. Human beings are vulnerable creatures who depend upon one another. Technological culture can begin to treat those limits as defects waiting for correction. Leo welcomes technologies that alleviate suffering. Again, if it alleviates suffering, great. If it helps us with our health, great, right? But to what extent is it surpassing or becoming a new paradigm, we're to the extent that we forget about those who are not as fortunate, privileged, or have accessibility to new technologies per se. And so this is when he talks about transhumanism, this idea that somehow looking at the human condition, our frailty or weakness, somehow technology can actually enhance human effects. So he's not saying that technology that helps us, some of us might be wearing heart pacers with us or artificial hearts. That's not evil. That's not bad. It's when we start using technology that it kind of replaces the notion that becomes the ideal to achieve, as opposed, and it winds up replacing the space where we can actually acknowledge the weakness and accept our human frailty. Not to the extent that we don't want to get better. I think the best analogy I could give is this. This is my own experience. Have you ever been like you're sick in bed, for a few days? And there's usually there's one point where I say to myself, I wonder if this is God telling me to humble myself, or to guess, I'm too busy, and then all of a sudden in that space, I'm thinking about, this might be a good time to examine my conscience, to relook, because if I wasn't sick, maybe my pride might have taken away. Now, that doesn't mean I'm not going to see a doctor. That doesn't mean I don't want to get better. You see, but what the Catholic Church is saying, Leo is saying this, that space, while we can still try to improve technology and try to get better, but that could still be a space for grace, of encountering God. It could still be a place where we experience even salvation, redemption. He wants to kind of safeguard that while we continue to get better, right? It's a tricky balance. But he's saying the transhumanism might be getting so far that what does humanity look like? Are we going to forget that space, which could also be a space of encountering God and God's grace? And then what I want to do is just briefly go through some of these chapters. All the chapters. Chapter 1, we kind of talked about already. These are images by the dicastery for promoting human development. I'm not going to go through all the pictures here, but we talked about human dignity already, because that was really the major part of introducing that theme in the introduction that we heard. But he wants to kind of preserve that, and this is against the idea of technology. How is this going? He's going to bring in a Christian anthropology. How do we understand the human person in light of the gospel and in light of our Catholic social teachings per se? When we get that, the next chapter will be, he wants to kind of situate this, like why are we talking about this? He wants to bring in Catholic social teaching and show that this is not the first time. Rerum Novarum, this is 135 years ago. He wants to show Catholic social teaching as this living tradition, wisdom of the church for the past 135 years. Of course, it goes back to the gospel and what Jesus did in his social, responses to the people in the margins and all those other social issues. But he's saying for the past 130 years, this has been going on. And so he kind of wants to position that and talk about, those, I was talking about chapter 3. I'm looking at the different notes. Chapter 2, I'm going to insert that, ignore the last 5 minutes. But what he's going to do is kind of talk about the particular pearls of wisdom within our Catholic social doctrine. So he'll talk about, for example, the universal destination of goods, asking whether technological benefits are shared equitably and reach those otherwise excluded. We're looking at who has power of AI right now, United States, China, right? We're still trying to bring laptops to other parts of the world. And our two countries are going to really accelerate. So what is that distribution, those areas? He talks about subsidiarity, asking whether affected communities participate in decisions. Subsidiarity might be, while we're making decisions and creating these AI tools, what about those little areas in the world? We have to listen to their voices. Are they being heard? Do we have people going there and asking, what do you think about ChatGPT? Or how is this going to affect your local community? So to what extent do they get an input to the development of AI tools? Solidarity, kind of showing how all of us are interconnected and we have, and thus we have a shared responsibility with one another. And then again, integral human development. How do we, to be fully human from a Christian anthropological perspective, it's not just our health, but it's also economics, it's also spiritual, it's also social, it's also ecology. The whole human development needs to be considered in all of this. That's what chapter 2 does. Then once he does that, he gave you, he kind of talked about the human dignity being there, a dynamic approach that is always going to be alive today, kind of showing these tenets, particular of Catholic social teaching. What he's going to show is that this has always been our history, and focused on that area. And that's what I kind of explained before. So I'm going to go to 4 for the sake of time. He then kind of talks about how is AI present today? How is it manifesting itself, per se? And in this area, this is where he's saying particularly 3 areas: truth, what is our thing of truth, work, and what's the other one now? And freedom. So now he's bringing it up to date. Truth. Of course, we know this, we have you heard of deep fakes? We don't know what is true anymore in the news. So AI is already giving us false truths, so deep fakes, per se. There was a famous AI generated image of Pope Francis wearing a winter puffer coat. It was AI generated. I think of the last of 2020 in Vermont. So during the primaries, about 4,000 people in Vermont received phone calls from President Biden to not vote. It was fake. What is truth anymore? We don't know what truth is. See, this is not the first time we've heard about this with the Magnificat, Humanitas, right? It's always been an issue. Work, you've been hearing that a lot, about the dignity of work. What happens? Who's going to replace how will AI replace those in those positions? Of course, right now you may have heard it's replacing entry-level positions. In the Philippines, where my ancestry lies, there are millions of telemarketers, or what do you call them? Call centers, right? AI is going to take those jobs easily. In fact, you've already experienced probably AI-generated voices, right? So what's going to happen? Are these companies going to go to the Philippines and give them other jobs? I don't think so. So those are the questions he's asking. And then freedom. And this is kind of interesting because AI has a way, and you all know what I'm talking about, of chipping away your freedom to choose. You still have a right to choose, but whether you realize it or not, we become addicted, or somehow it works silently. I'm going to speak about this later on. So do we really have freedom, particularly with advances in surveillance and all those other areas? And then even how quietly marketing and companies will want to chip away at that freedom. That's been going on, and we already learned what social media has done, not only to the younger generation. Everyone talks about Generation Z, but for all of us in this room, all of us are affected by that. So where is the degree of freedom there? The last thing in chapter 5 is that he talks about building a civilization of love. He expands this now to what's going on in the world, where there seems to be this where violence and war is becoming normalized. How does AI affect that, right? People, governments could actually use AI to deploy weapons, right? And because it could be so automated, they're not really thinking about the in-between, what's going on in between, or the people, right? In other words, there's a lot of power there. And we have to be careful how AI is going to be used in unjust or unjust wars, whatever that may be. So he kind of expands it beyond there. And then lastly, he concludes with the builders of communion. Look at my clock here. The conclusion of Magnificat Humanitas brings us back to Christ. The Word became flesh, and the vulnerable body of Christ reveals the worth of every human person, whom the world has diminished or silenced. The Eucharist forms the church as one body and calls Christians, communities, to preserve human bodies, human bonds, wherever technological networks generate isolation. He also brings up the Magnificat that Mary proclaims, where the church learns to view history from the side of the lowly. Christian hope enters the technological future with the confidence that displays of worldly power never tell the whole story of what God is saying. The encyclical invites his readers into this construction site, and he uses that term. We're part of this construction site now, right, of the present age. Public responsibility belongs to that work, as does conversion of heart. Communities need enough knowledge to ask how technologies are designed and who is affected by them. They must also remain attentive to the desires and habits developing within the people who actually use them. Pope Leo finally calls us to become builders of communion. God remains at the center of the work and the human person at the center of our choices. The future described in these pages is already being built through decisions about technological power and how it will be used. What I want to do is kind of shift, now that you see a lot of that, and this is coming from shameless promotion of a book which I finished writing last week, called The Catholic Handbook of AI, probably be out in 6 months. But I use the word diakrisis, and this is the Greek notion of diakrisis, as something deeper than just discernment. Discernment is the broader practice, right, through which we can seek a faithful action. We have to decide, right, in order to seek this, in order to make a decision or action. Within that practice, our Christian tradition uses the Greek word diakrisis to name the Spirit-taught capacity to distinguish what is generally of God, what generally appears to be God, and what generally is not God. That middle one is where it's difficult. It appears to be God, because if you used these AI, it could come up with an answer and go, wow, it's like God. But is it appearing to be God? Because as Dr. Tinieri kind of said, there's a lot of deep fakes. There's a lot of things that gets wrong. So diakrisis is a spirit-led discernment that can help us distinguish what is of God, what appears to be God, and what is definitely not God. St. Paul uses it, right, when he talks about one of the gifts, the discernment of spirits. One of the Desert Fathers, John Cassian, talks about discernment, diakrisis, being the mother of all virtues. Because you could do the other virtues, but if you don't know how and when to make a decision, then nothing else really matters, they'll say. And if you're familiar with Jesuit spirituality, right, the Ignatian spirituality, heavily diakrisis, the idea of discernment. That's the kind of diakrisis that I want to kind of focus on. And what I do here is that I talk about 5 frameworks for Christian diakrisis. I'm going to get away from my text and kind of just talk about this. I'm mindful of time. Oh, good, I got enough time. So the first framework, this is again bringing a lot of the things I already said, but I kind of want to systematize it into 5. The problem with any kind of categories or systematization is that all categories leak. I realize I could probably name 12 or 20, but for the sake of the book, I just want to something that could be interchangeable, that could cover a lot of areas. So the first one is what I've been talking about already, dignity in the human encounter. I'm not going to repeat a lot of that, but AI does not. In my book, I kind of talk about this priest visiting a patient in a hospital, and he sees before he enters, there's a little robot there. This is already going on, giving medication to the patient, and it's also talking with the patient. You know, now believe it or not, some studies show that it's functional. It's able to deliver medication, and some people actually enjoy the conversation because it prevents them from being bored. At least there's something there. And so the priest enters, and he doesn't know what can a priest do that a robot cannot do. That's where the diaconis comes in. I went through CPE, clinical pastoral training, right, and education. So when I go to a hospital and I visit a patient, not yet, robots cannot do this yet, but I've learned how to look at cues. Is the patient clutching the rosary? Is there perspiration? There are some cues that I could pick up when I know when to change topics. Or I might even, I'll just know, like maybe they're sitting, when I enter, they're sitting at the window, or they don't want to speak. So that's something that I've learned in my embodied encountering with each patient. One day, AI robots may be able to pick that up. But to what extent will it replace my human presence, the human dignity that we both share, To what extent will it not? To what extent will it? This is diaconis. It's both and. And we're going to have to weigh what that looks like, to what extent might that look like. Right now, it doesn't replace a very well-educated or well-trained hospital chaplain. There are some times that it might. There are some hospital chaplains, maybe they're not the best at what they do, and maybe robots will be able to. Those are the questions we have to ask, right? In many ways. The first framework therefore asks how AI might support human relationships while preserving the difference between assistance and a human encounter. AI can assist us, but is it human encounter? And if so, to what extent is it and is it not? Will AI help us return to one another with greater care? If it helps us encounter a patient better, use it. If it's going to lead, I might not know Vietnamese. I'll be able to just click my earlobe one day, because it might be embedded in my earlobe. We can talk about that later. And maybe speak fluently to someone who's Vietnamese. That's going to help our encounter. AI could be very useful. I'm kind of both and here. But we have to ask these questions to get to the moral foundation of who we are. As AI becomes more capable of resembling us, the distinction between a convincing response and a human encounter would become harder to see. Christian anthropology reminds us why the distinction remains important. Human presence comes from another person whose life can be interrupted by ours, and who bears responsibility for those responses. So even if I'm not a perfect chaplain, is there anything bad about that necessarily? Is there anything? Because sometimes that could be a moment of grace, right? Unexpected grace. It doesn't mean we can't improve ourselves. I'm sure a CPE program, since I took it 15 years ago, has improved. So I'm all for that. Is it going to lead to deeper encounter, right? While still striking that balance. The second framework, formation and responsibilities. All of these are AI generated from ChatGPT that I've done. I pasted my text. I go, make an image of this. This is what comes out. Yeah, boy, I could go to town with this. But how is AI forming us spiritually? Let me give an example of preachers, right? Clergy, deacons, priests, bishops. I could come up with a homily in 10 seconds, right? That's now before, actually continues. When I prepare a homily, I like to, what one of my Paulist brothers said, I like to wrestle with the angel of Scripture. It's really my present spirituality, Scripture, and preparing for a homily, because then I like to go, oh, I forgot about that passage in 1 Corinthians. So let me find out, I like to wrestle with the angel of Scripture. I don't know how else to describe it, because it's a good cognitive friction, which I'll bring up soon. That cognitive friction allows me to maybe discover something new. That's part of my formation. That's teaching me to be a preacher, per se. At the same time, I could use AI to say, remind me again of this pericope or this particular, part of of the scripture passage. I could go into the website, I get a synthesis of that. I could say, here's a homily. I'm looking for a good opening story, maybe something from Mother Teresa, of a good quote. Now, I could do that also alone and go through that cognitive friction of going with the rest of it. Other times, it depends on the degrees of the formation to which a minister needs to discern, right? If it's in the beginning, I'd say for seminarians, don't wrestle with the angels. So those are the kind of questions. As we know, teacher and student relationships are beginning to be a major impact in this, right? Where is the critical thinking when students can now just write an essay, within a few minutes? This is where we presently are now. We're responding to AI, and now teachers need to find out, how do we evaluate that? Where is the critical thinking and formation per se? And this is kind of interesting. It might be, a lot more teachers are doing like oral conversations. We're kind of at this juncture where we are responding to our old or still present model of grading, right, and evaluating, while still trying to find where will the critical thinking come in. It might get to, this is provocative, don't quote me here, but it might get to a point where we actually, let me preface this. I was giving a talk at St. Joseph Seminary for the seminary in New York City, for the New York Archdiocese. And they have policies now for the seminarians not to use AI for writing, but you could use it for research, grammar, and all these. And schools are doing this, and universities are doing this too, right? They have policies. Students can. The thing is, I'm going to be a realist here. After 2 p.m., after 3 p.m. when they go home, they're using it. That's my judgment. They're still using it. I don't know how you take that, but they're still using it, unless you're there in the bedroom and office overlooking them and watching them. So this is where the dilemma comes in. How do we wrestle with this? It might come to a point when we need to kind of do the opposite. And this might be 10 years down the line or 5 years. Go home, do all the, in other words, right now, the classic way has been, in the classroom settings, 4 walls, you learn the content, and then you do the assignments at home to prove that you know and understand the content. There might be a time we might just switch that. If you're using AI already, go home, go to town. Bear with me for a moment, because you're using it anyway. So going home becomes a space for learning and content. But then we come back together, human close proximity, and we talk about what it generated. And then I begin to evaluate. Did you realize that that's false? Did you do your studying? Did you do your research? Sort of like the Socratic Oxford University model. You kind of talk with a professor, and then maybe new ways of grading will have to come out of that. I'm just going to open your mind that might be where we're leading to. We can't get to that yet because our educational system, seminary, is built on this model: 4 walls, classroom, go home. Or in the seminary, go to your bedroom, come back again. If you want to get a taste of the third way, it would be what I call the Matrix Neo, learning Kung Fu. If you know the Matrix, Keanu Reeves is learning about all this new advanced technologies, and they do this what I call cognitive offloading. They can stick something in his brain, and within 10 seconds, he knows Kung Fu. May I propose that might one day happen? I won't have to learn about Rahner's supernatural existentialism. I'll just have this and I'll know it. But will it be an embodied learning? I'll know the content. I might be able to but will it experiential words? Those are the questions. I'm not advocating that. I just want to set up parameters of discernment as we move forward. So that's what it is. And where will critical thinking go? Where will cognitive friction go? In other words, rather than getting the answer right away, which we're all doing, where is the actual wrestling with the text, friction? Because that's also a way of discovering something new, creativity. Like I was speaking with a librarian here. I forgot your name. the idea of, when I was going to the seminary back in the 80s, I would go to the Dewey Decimal System. I go to the stacks of the library to get my book, but all of a sudden I learned, oh, I never knew about this book sitting next to it. So I begin to read about that. That was another way of learning. But then there were advantages of this other one. If I know the content, is it a matter that I just learn the content and then later on embody it afterwards? I just want to be provocative to get you to think, all right? Those are the frameworks we have to look at. Truth and creativity and authorship. If you don't know, I'm a liturgical composer, and once I asked ChatGPT, I don't know if I have a demonstration here. I thought I had it here. To write me a song for Epiphany. And within 30 seconds, I don't know if you do. That came out. It usually takes me 3 months to write a liturgical song. I didn't say I don't want Christian rock, but I wasn't specific enough. Not bad, actually. I mean, as a song, right? Wise men travel far and wide to the humble place he'd hide. Bethlehem, a town so small, there they found the King of all. It's a Christian contemporary. It gave me, within a minute and a half, the first one came out, 2 versions of that. So now, of course, what are the ethical parameters? It's borrowing from every other song about Epiphany out of the internet. Copyrights already being violated. If it's borrowing a song that I wrote, I'm not getting the residuals. And, for my sustained ministry life, these are economic justice issues, actually. You see, it's borrowing. And we don't know how or why it would choose one particular song or the other. Christopher Ola, the guy who was at the Vatican, he's the expert at that. What we call mechanistic interpretability, the idea of a black box. Why is it choosing some songs all of the others? So it could generate it beautifully. It might even move us to actually sing. And there are some Christian denominations that are using AI-generated songs already, but they're being transparent about it. Where's the human in that? Well, it might be because it came from human songs already. These are gray areas, right? But then where are issues of justice and truth? Authorship. Can an author stand behind a painting, picture, text, music that they create, per se? With that song, if I were to share it on YouTube, I don't own the copyright of that because it was AI generated, per se. Work, rest, and keeping Sabbath. 2007, I was living in San Francisco and actually stood in line to buy the very first iPhone. After a half hour, I said, forget this. It was like 3 blocks long. I came back at 4:30 p.m., about an hour and a half before it was going to close, and there was only like 20 people. I go, oh, now's my time. Remember the time you first got your smartphone or you got an email address for the very first time, and you said to yourself, I'm not going to share my telephone number with anyone, only these 10 people. Or when you got an email address for the first time, or whenever you get a new one, you say, I'm only going to check my email twice a day. What's the reality? What happened the last 20 years? We fill up time. AI, when used wisely, is going to lead to human flourishing that will be able to actually have time for other things. But what gets filled in? If there's any pattern we've been learning, we fill it up with more stuff. When I ought to be, with the free time I've had since the internet and since AI, I ought to be exercising more, calling my mother more. Actually, I'm pretty good at that. Entertainment, leisure's not an evil word. But what happens, this is why with the efficiency of AI, what happens to Sabbath? what I remember the first time I came back from the seminary. On a Sunday, I began to bring my laundry bag down the stairs, and my mother, Filipino, said, "Why are you doing your laundry on a Sunday?" I go, "I never heard of this. Yeah, in the Philippines, we're not supposed to do work on a Sunday." Now what do we do? Now our Sundays are all occupied. We have to, we have to go to Costco. We have to cut the lawn. If we have time for family, that's going to be secondary. AI is going to accelerate that even more so, if it hasn't already, because we know already what the last 20, 30 years has been, even more so. So that's a framework, discernment framework. The last framework would be the larger ecological creation in our common home. Our fifth framework widens the field even more. AI can feel almost immaterial. I think Dr. Tenier kind of talked about this, but in fact, there's a lot of energy and water that goes on there that made to use it. Now, someone asked about that. It's actually debatable. Maybe about 4 years ago or 3 years ago, we began to say that for every one prompt, there was something going around the internet that's about 500 millimeters of water, which is like that. So it does take energy, but then more recent studies show that was actually exaggerated. It's actually more like 0.26 millimeters of water. There's a debate. Some people say, well, once we get that AI and the better systems, we'll be able to solve a lot of ecological problems. And that's probably true, we will. But on the meantime, what about all the energy areas? Some people argue that actually, when we use AI, when we use water to cool the systems down, it's actually evaporating. And so it evaporates when the water is not essentially disappearing. It's actually going to come back to the ecological cycle. That's their argument why we need to. But then if you're in Arizona and in a drought, and you're experiencing drought, and you say, don't worry, people in Arizona, the water's disappearing right now, but it's going to come back. And it's like, they're not going to care, right? But for people in Wisconsin, maybe it's not as drought as there. So all of these issues are kind of gray, but we need to discern, looking at our Catholic values and social ethics, how we do that. And it's already making a difference. People are already protesting and even affecting elections coming up. Integrating the 5 works, basically taking together these 5 frameworks remind us that no use of AI can be judged by a single measure. A technology may protect one genuine good while placing another at risk. I can use it for this good, but it actually might, without us seeing it, do something else. It may save time while weakening a human capacity. So it might save time, and we might gain new capacities, but then what will be left behind, as all technologies for the existence of humanity has shown? What will be new? What will be dropped or forgotten? It may widen access while transferring hidden costs to another community. You see the yin-yang going on here, with all the pros and cons. That is why these frameworks are best understood together. Dignity, formation, truth, work, and care for creation gives us a different way of seeing the same technological choice before us. Diacrisis asks us to remain with the whole picture long enough to recognize these tensions and to discern what is generally of God in what is emerging as AI continues to progress. At an accelerated pace, that's the other component. It's not that it's always emerging, it's getting faster and faster. Dr. Tenier talked about generative AI. We're already, by the way, if you didn't know, we're already at the age of agentic AI. And if you don't know that is, I can't explain it within this scope, but within a year or two, we're going to go into AGI. So how do we keep up with the acceleration? That's what we need to, so the Pope in some ways is kind of say, he's kind of in a position like, well, let's pause here, make sure we know what we're doing, before we advance it even more. What are the moral parameters? What are the governance or rule? The critique of that is he being real? Are the developers going to slow down? I want to hope so. And that's where we can have some influence, because the Catholic Church is a global community. And Pope Leo's Magnificat is already making significant difference, the widespread. So I want to hope it can, and I do believe it can. The future has not yet been written. I know that sounds like an anecdote. It really does. I mean, I really mean that. It hasn't, we can still, we're not at this AGI stage where artificial intelligence is actually supplanting humanity yet. So we're still at a time, which is why I'm so proud of the Catholic Church. We've always been ahead, actually, more than most religious communities out there. The Roman Catholic Church has always been ahead of AI. I gave you the history, which is why I wanted to talk about that. So we, as a collective body, can influence the world. I want to conclude with returning to that construction site that Pope Leo places before us. We began tracing the Church's growing engagement with AI. We then entered the theological vision of Magnificat Humanitas, where Babel and Jerusalem revealed two different ways of building with human power. Finally, the 5 frameworks gave us a way to consider how our choices about AI shape human encounter, formation, truth, and our common home. The technological future is still being built. What AI becomes in human life will depend in no small part upon the choices we make about it today. The central question running through the entire presentation is therefore this larger question: what kind of common life are we building? And what kind of people are we becoming as we build it? Remember that one question. For Christians, the measure of the technological future lies in how faithful human beings recognize one another as persons created and loved by God. Technology serves its proper purpose when it helps us care for the life that God has entrusted to us and strengthens our ability to build communion. It's about networking, transnational dialogue with other governments, with other religions. It's one of the things I said when I talked to the Vatican. The Roman Catholic Church is not the only religion. How do we also, have dialogue with the Protestants? The evangelicals came up with a statement already. The Jewish people, the Muslim. From a religious perspective, we need to expand it beyond ourselves to move forward. We may enter that work with hope, guided by the Spirit and confident in the magnificent humanity God has created and Christ has redeemed. I want to end with just these 3 questions, which I think I have in your handout. Where do you see signs of Babel in the ways AI is being developed or used? And where do you see possibilities for building Jerusalem in your own life and or ministry and or community? Which of the 5 frameworks reveals the most urgent concern in your ministry or community? Which one are you most likely to overlook? And what might therefore remain hidden? There's something about the hidden, like all technology, the hiddenness of how AI progresses. We have to keep it. That's why transparency is so needed. We need transparency, 3, consider one current or proposed use of AI in your setting. What good might come out of that? Is it serving that? If it is, great. But what might it place at risk? And what kind of common life might it help us build? Last few things. By the way, I think I had my slides reversed when it came to chapters 2 and 3. Hopefully the outline, because I wasn't able to see this clearly per se, but look at the outline more than my talk. To maybe erase that one portion or read the document yourself. This just came out the other day. I know you got copies of Bishop Barron. I don't have the level of Bishop Barron, but in Paulus Fest, I wrote my own introduction of the encyclical. This is the book I just wrote, The Catholic Handbook on AI. That's my own art generation because it's not out yet until 6 months. But the Catholic Handbook on AI is just meant to be a pastoral guide. After this portion, I talked about Feinberg. I then talk about the third part of the book. I said, well, what does this mean for clergy? What does this mean for the parent? What does this mean for the hospital chaplain? What does this mean for, I'm a pastoral theologian, so I kind of break that up more. Finally, I started with the Sisters of St. Joseph, the Pauline Sisters, this website, Catholic Faith AI, as a sort of like a digital hub. I wrote something there for preaching, which I hope every seminary uses, about how to use AI wisely and when not to use AI when you're preparing homilies. I also wrote the primer on AI. Like, what is AI? But Sister Nancy Ulsaman, director, she also wrote some articles there about social media and AI and teenagers. So that could be a wonderful resource for you. Last thing I want to say, I thought that was the last thing. I'm coming back, I believe, March 14th. I think March 14th, to kind of be much more practical, although I thought I was pretty pastoral now. When I come back on March 14th, I'm going to say, what does this actually look like in your ministries and in your life? So I'm going to take that one step further. How do we actually use AI using these principles, a little bit more practical lens, okay? Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much in an age where attention is rare. So.
Thank you, Father Ricky, for providing us with this 5 discernment framework for Christian diacrisis. It is time now for questions. I have a question that comes from somebody I want to ask. Father Ricky, is AI evil? Does it make us stupid?
Well, Pope Leo says right away that AI is not inherently evil. So it's a thing, it's not inherently evil. Now, it could be used for evil purposes. Or who am I to judge? People who use it for evil purposes, they might be evil, but I don't want to judge that. But yeah, so I don't know if this means we're stupid. No, we're at a time of discernment. Technically, in some ways, if I remember from my agonizing years of formation as a seminarian, discernment is a choice between 2 or more goods. Like, should I stay with this community or should I leave? Either way would be a good. It's not one. So it's not that we're stupid. We're at a place of discernment. We just need frameworks to decide how we use and deploy AI. We might be ignorant about what AI is. Hopefully, some of the things you learned today will help you, now engage with it better. That's one thing I want to recommend. Start to learn about it, depending on your capacity to learn. As far as processing so much information. But now that you got some fundamentals down, you might want to learn more about like agentic AI or all these talks about the Catholic perspective on AI. Gently, don't go head over heels over it, but just begin to learn more about it as it continues to emerge. Yeah.
I don't think it's stupid, but that idea that it's not morally neutral.
Yes. She was just saying, I just want to repeat that. She was saying that it's not morally neutral. And Pope Leo also says that. It's not morally neutral, it's a grab. Yeah. It's not more, it depends on who's using it. That's where the morality lies.
So there's a sentence in paragraph 98.
Oh, wow. Oh, no.
That I would like you to help me understand. It says, current AI systems are more cultivated than built.
Yeah.
For developers do not directly design detail, but instead create a framework in which the intelligence grows.
I want to be able to read that. I don't have a copy of it for the people who may not have heard that. And what number is that? As I think about my answer, where is it? AI 98. The whole thing? Where is that? Oh, indeed, current AI systems are more cultivated than built for developers. For developers do not directly design every detail. That's true. So we might have the ingenuity and technology to continue to create and build AI. But even more important, this is why I'm interpreting this, are how it's cultivated into the fabric of our worldview. So I told you, Pope Leo talks about this. There's this invisibility aspect of AI that's built around a culture of power, a culture of what constitutes human, what constitutes our Catholic faith. The way I'm reading this, that's actually more powerful than the actual technology to build it, because that's going to shape how we build, what tools we create, We could create millions of tools, but which ones are we going to? Are we going to create tools for the sake of profit, or war, or are we going to create? So it's a larger cultural that's being cultivated, larger cultural symbols of how we see the world and how we see ourselves standing before God. And then James, that's you. Oh, I got. Yes, please stand.
Okay. My question is, as a theologian that thinks a lot about this technology, but you also call yourself a pastoral theologian. I work with a lot of young adults that are very fearful about where opportunities coming out of college. What do they do next? How do you talk to your adults about this?
Yeah.
Do you calm them down?
So what was the first thing I recommended at the beginning? I know it's a scapegoat, but what did I say that you can provide anyone? Provide them discernment frameworks. Let them see the both and. Now, having said that, particular social groups are in different positionalities. Right now, the younger generation, they have all the right to be fearful of of jobs, because in fact it is affecting some job replacements. I was speaking with lawyers, some of the first entry lawyers, all that work, like take these 10 volumes, analyze it, that could be done with AI. So what happens to that position? More importantly, before AI or before even technology, they would come into the firm and they would learn that, but now they're not going to have that embodied learning. It's going to be AI. So in some ways, I'm just using law as one example. What's going to be lost with that? Is it all about efficiency per se? I think what college students ought to do is really right at the beginning. If I know if they graduate, it might be too late, but you have to call the institution to task. And they're still trying to grapple it. Not every educational system has policies. I always suggest, and I'd say this when I give talks at dioceses, religious organizations like yourselves, or churches wherever I go. What is your AA policy? Now, it doesn't have to be a formalized statement, but it might be, how are you all approaching AI? And this is a great start. You're invited people to come, and now you learn. But you might talk about what is our. A third of my time I do. I'm part of It's called the Communion Project, and my work is to bring together, if you can believe it, red and blue Catholics and polarization. In fact, that's another book that just came out last week. And 2 years ago, I brought 100 Catholic leaders from left, right, red, and blue together to talk about polarization. I even had, for the first time, the two editors of the NCRs, NC Reporter, NC Register, to come together and talk about how media. Now, where was I going with this? So I have a team of 3 people. One of them is in charge of Facebook posts. And she put a post about Pope Leo with this quote about what he said about AI. It was incorrect. It was paraphrased. And I said, you can paraphrase it, but you have to say it as a paraphrase. It's not a quote. In other words, we at that time, we didn't have an AI policy of how my organization, the Communion Project, is going to use AI. So now we do. You see what I'm saying? And as the legal system, this should scare you a tiny bit to get a policy in place, as the legal system progresses, more and more cases are going to come up about what constitutes a violation of copyright or use or misuse. No, we don't have it yet. There was, I think, maybe 6 months ago, I think there was the first case where someone was finally convicted of AI because he was using it for child pornography. So we're going to see more cases like that as the legal system catches up. They're still actually grappling what constitutes copyright. That's why we need governments to lead us to look at governance structures, rail holdings, rail structures, right? All these various things. And so that would be my thing. To what extent is the institution preparing? But don't abuse them or criticize them either. They're still waiting for the government to come up. What's going on now is that you have particular educational institutions coming up with their own policy with or without the government at the local level. You have particular dioceses, Baltimore and Los Angeles are the only two I know out of how many dioceses that have AI policies. It's still new. Magnificat just came out in May. But that's why I'm suggesting, learn about it, not out of fear, but now that you have a foundation, it's going to continue to grow. Now that you have this event, take it to the next step. Come up with a committee, experts, invite other people, ethicists. Ask Loyola Marymount, how are you looking at AI? Begin to do that. And I think students need to demand that, in some ways for their, that's a long answer, but. Oh, James had a question, I know. And then, so another one, I think.
Recommend to come here.
Oh, can you come up here? I might be able to repeat it. Father James.
To help people on Zoom to follow also the questions.
In our era, there is documented greater isolation of people. And there's also record of people turning more and more to AI personalities for companionship. And especially within that umbrella, there are people who are turning to AI for so-called therapy or pastoral counseling that has even led to self-harm and suicide. Yeah. Can you address, how do we address that?
Yeah, I think that's always, now even before ChatGPT 3.5, November 2022, people have always been using media some of us might use WebMD rather than going to a doctor. Right now, it's at the legal perspective, there are maybe a dozen cases where they're trying to link AI to suicide or the use of that. Because now, the gray moral question is what? To what extent is it the AI's tool's fault, or is it the informed or non-informed user and choices that she or he makes, in the use of it? But what you bring up still, and this is where I totally understand what you're saying, it's taking the place of that human encounter, right? Because of accessibility, I would love to talk to Father Ricky, or, Father Vienna about this moral issue, but it's 2:00 in the morning. So, and I'm awake, I'm going to ask ChatGPT. So how do we weigh the accessibility and the human presence, in all of this? We're experiencing less and less ministers, in hospitals. Is there a debate that it's better to have an AI robot than nothing? Look at the decline in vocations in the priesthood. Is AI going to in some religions it already is, replacing clergy or the ordained? At one level, this has always been going in human history, technology replacing. So what's gained, what's lost, per se? The particular age of AI is the acceleration and the illusionment that it's so human-like, that it gets even closer to replacing human more than the printing press did. You know what I'm saying? So that's the fine line that we have to watch, which is why we have to be mindful without going crazy, being mindful of that continuum, develop it now. What is that? And I mean, on a personal note, develop what's your spirituality when it comes to AI. You were supposed to do that with social media and new technology, but sometimes we failed at that. You know what I'm saying? Now is the time to really relook and re-examine how you see technology as part of your life. Do I have to have more Facebook friends? Do I have to have more likes? I was part of that, I mean, just that's always been around. AI is going to accelerate that. So now is a call to get more centered, while accompanying your development of AI know-how, because that shouldn't fall I hate to say that. It shouldn't fall. Otherwise, it's just going to go so fast, you know. But there might be like human movements like going on now. There's something that's just going to say enough of this. And it's going to affect politics. It's going to affect the future, the choices we make. It's not written in stone, you know. And this is, I'm speaking so humanistic. This is where faith comes in. This is where the grace of the Holy Spirit, our faith comes in. We can't do this alone. But I'm trying to describe to you. Do you think you could do that alone? No, Pope Leo was talking about this. We need to stand before God. We need a community. We need to create partnerships. We need to be in a discernment of like-minded talks with other people. It's not about yourself. That's where it's more about isolation than it is about the technology per se. And the availability of technology that perhaps, and we don't know yet, we don't have the trials, that perhaps it influenced the suicide per se. And to what extent, you know, that remains to be seen.
Father Ricky will come back. So I know we have many questions for him. As we bring to a close this first session, I would like to make an announcement. Because of the importance and the complexity of this topic, the colloquium unfolded in 3 sessions. Today, August 12, 2026 was the first session. March 12, 2027 will be the second session. And our last session will be on August 12, 2027. The registration will be open soon. Secure your seat, please, if you have time. I want to express my sincere gratitude to all of you for your presence here, for your attention, and your thoughtful participation. Our conversation today reminds us that artificial intelligence is not only a technical question, but also a deeply human, ethical, and spiritual one. I offer special thanks to everyone who helped make this gathering possible. Our presenters, Dr. Khalid Tanir, Father Ricky Manalo, our volunteers, and all who assist behind the scenes. Joe with audio visual, Joe is there. Corey, Monica, Emily, Rachel, Jenny, Mary Goski is here, Dave Wild, the food service, Clayton, Mike Irato, Father Raphael, Father Vincent. I hope I didn't forget anybody. I am also grateful to our sponsor, the Priest of the Sacred Heart. I ask you to applaud Father Vienne and his customer. They strongly support this conversation, and they want to help us familiarize with the church teaching on AI. So this colloquium continues, and we will meet in March. As I said, please secure your seat.